Welcome back. You're listening to This Week with Carol Coleman and Justin McCarthy. Now, earlier this week, the European Parliament voted overwhelmingly to adopt a resolution condemning the war in Ukraine as illegal, unprovoked and unjustified military aggression by Russia. A massive majority, 637 MEPs, voted in favour of the motion. Just 13 voted against, including 2 Irish MEPs, Mick Wallace and Clare Daly. Well, earlier I spoke with Clare Daly and asked her who she was representing when she voted against the resolution on Tuesday. Was it her own political ideology, or was she representing the Irish people?
I think it was very much representing the mandate in which I contested the European elections, and every election before that war and militarism isn't a solution to any conflict, that Ireland as a neutral country should very much put itself forward in arguing for a diplomatic resolution. So while forthrightly condemning the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine, and the voting record shows that we voted for those parts of the resolution, what we opposed was the increasing of arms into Ukraine, the acceleration of NATO involvement, and the acceleration of militarism and military expenditure inside the EU.
So do you think then that the Irish people want innocent people in Ukraine to be left without any help or support at all, to be slaughtered by an advancing Russian military?
I certainly don't. And I think that the calls of the Irish people for arms and for military might to be sent into Ukraine are very well intentioned, that people think when making that call that they are helping. They see an uneven fight, and it is an uneven fight. But the measures that the European Union took to hurl extra military hardware into Ukraine is not going to even up that fight. I mean, we see a scenario now where NATO and the West have said they are not going to get involved with boots on the ground. They're not going to get involved in the skies, but yet because they say that Russia and a war with Russia in Europe cannot be won, yet they're happy to send arms in to young, untrained volunteers and ordinary civilians in Ukraine and expect them to carry out that fight. That's utter lunacy. There cannot be a military solution to this conflict. And the longer it goes on, the more Ukrainians are going to die, and the more that conflict is going to be prolonged. And that is something that I absolutely could not have anything to do with. And that's not the same thing as saying leave Ukrainians defenseless. What we're saying is that Europe should be stepping in to negotiate an end to the war, a negotiation of peace. That's the only way in which the Ukrainians can be saved.
Okay, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But I just want to ask you. You describe yourself as a peace activist. Why then were you so willing to accept the build-up of the Russian military on the border of Ukraine when that was happening in recent weeks? I mean, for example, let's hear what you said on January 28th in your own podcast, the I4C Trouble podcast, with yourself and Mick Wallace.
The idea that the Russians are just on some mad rampage of wanting to sort of willy-nilly invade Ukraine, which has been hysterically drummed up in the West, is just not factually accurate. In actual fact, what is accurate is that the Russians have been taunted and sort of, I'm trying to get the good word for it now, but harassed for years by the West, really, in this area. And they've had enough of the sort of growing NATO propaganda on their borders undermine them. And they're saying, you've pushed us enough, don't go any further or we're going to react. So in that sense, we would say the mobilisation of Russian troops, we don't want troops mobilised anywhere, but that it's very much in a sense of they're protecting their turf.
They were protecting their turf. That's what you said on January 28th. You're justifying there the massing of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine preparing for war, weren't you?
Absolutely not. I mean, the first thing to say about that, we weren't alone in thinking that Russians wouldn't invade. Zelensky and probably most of the Ukrainian population didn't believe that Russia would invade. I think many European powers didn't think that they would either. But the point that we were making is that this narrative that somehow the war is happening because we're dealing with some crazed maniac in the form of Putin is a distortion of the reality that one of the contributing factors to this situation has been the constant destabilization of that region by NATO and the US over the past 8 years.
It wasn't NATO
on
tanks.
The borders of
it wasn't NATO tanks that were rolling east there when you said that. It was Russian tanks moving west, and you didn't speak up.
The Russian tanks were in Russia, and they've been in Russia many times before that. And many people didn't believe that they would cross over. But that doesn't negate from the fact, and bear in mind, we have been absolutely forthright in our condemnation of the fact that they did cross over that line. We have been unequivocal in that. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the reason that they were there is based on the fact that over the past 8 years, the US and NATO have been destabilizing that area on Russia's borders. We've got to a situation where now missiles are being created in Ukraine which can target Russia. And in the same way as we nearly came to conflict in the Bay of Pigs in Cuba when Russia wanted to put missiles on the United States border, that was a step too far for Russia. And you don't need to be a genius. That doesn't mean I'm justifying the action of the Russian military. I don't justify that. I'm clearly on record as saying it's unjustifiable, but it does explain the circumstances of how we got here. And unless we explain how we got here, we can't get a way out.
I want to play one last clip from that podcast on January 28th.
There's no evidence to support the idea of Russia being on a big campaign to seize chunks of the Ukraine, and it wouldn't be in their interest to do that. But yet that's currency. If you were to stop people on the street now and ask them, who do they think is the aggressor? 9 people out of 10 would say, oh, Russia are on a mad one. They're going trying to invade everywhere.
Well, they're fed the lie by corporate mainstream media.
You said that the Russians, Clare Daly, were protecting their turf, that they weren't advancing or trying to undermine Ukraine. Do you regret saying that now?
No, I don't. I mean, you're selectively taking pieces out of a broader podcast which set to contextualise this conflict in a probably an hour-long episode. And I suppose what I absolutely stand over is there is a narrative being created that the war in Ukraine is somehow the result of a despot in the form of Putin. The point being made at that time, which we absolutely stand over, is that reality is not about heroes and villains. There has been a destabilization of that region for the past 8 years, spearheaded by NATO and the US, and that unfortunately the Ukrainian people are at the back of that. Zelensky was elected on a platform of peace, of dealing with Russia and getting a resolution to the problems around Minsk II. He didn't implement that agreement. He was prevented from doing so internally. And unfortunately, the international powers didn't stand by him to get that. And
okay, but I want to ask about your view.
What I regret is that the European Union, who should be promoting peace, are actually accelerating that conflict. And since the conflict has started, not only have the Ukrainian people been absolutely devastated, their lives lost, driven from their home, what we also see is that the US dollar has escalated against the euro. Fracked gas terminals are now being built in Europe.
Why, when the world was speaking out against the threat of Russian forces on the border with Ukraine, were you downplaying it and justifying it?
I wasn't justifying it, and I defy you to find any evidence of justifying.
You said they were protecting their turf, that the mobilisation of Russian troops, in a sense, they're protecting their turf. They're not advancing and trying to undermine Ukraine. That's what you said.
War being waged and crossing that line by Russia, which took place many weeks after that podcast. What I was saying at that time, Zelensky was saying at that time, the Germans were saying at that time. So since the war has crossed, everything has changed utterly.
Okay.
That is illegal, and I condemned it. But hang on, that's not the same as saying that Russia doesn't have genuine security concerns, which are legitimate, and they do.
Do you support any help then being given to the people of Ukraine to defend themselves?
That's an outrageous question, Justin. I support every help going to the Ukrainians. We've been to the forefront of the work in the European Parliament on the Libe Committee in terms of humanitarian assistance, humanitarian corridors, visa. But do I support military weaponry going into Ukraine? Do I expect young, untrained civilians in Ukraine to stand up to the might of the Russian army when NATO and the US have said they're not going in to fight? No, I don't. That would be suicidal folly. And I respect the Ukrainian people too much. I draw on my experience of all of the wars the world over to say that is the last thing that the Ukrainian people need. So what I
about
do
sanctions
demand
then?
is
What about,
peace
do you support
and a stopping of the war? No, what I demand is stopping the war. Why can't we look at promoting peace? There are going to be no winners in this scenario. And I know what you're doing. You're running a programme playing bits of commentary that we made 6-8 weeks ago, commentary that Zelensky and other people made as well. That doesn't show anything. We're in the here and now, and people in Ukraine are dying. And the way out of this isn't to send them in some tanks and anti-aircraft missiles that they're not trained to utilise. It's for the European Union to sit down at the table and say enough bloodshed. There needs to be serious peace talks. And part of that is a recognition of the fact that Russia does have genuine security concerns in that region. And unless we go to that place, unfortunately, the Ukrainians are going to be the losers in it.
Do you accept that sanctions are now justified? I know you've spoken out against them in the past, but now that the war has started, the sanctions are there to choke the Russian economy so that President Putin doesn't have money to fund his war machine. Isn't that justification?
It doesn't work. Unfortunately, there's been no experience anywhere of sanctions working in that regard. The Russian authorities have prepared for this war. They have a certain amount of backing from China in that sense to continue it. And the people who are suffering are the ordinary Russian citizens from this. The citizens of the entire European continent are going to be suffering from it. War is always wrong, no matter where it's carried out.
Okay, so you don't support
the international? No, what I support is the cessation of hostilities. Like what's so wrong with demanding a stopping of the war, a ceasefire, and an end to the conflict, and a sit down and a proper negotiated settlement of saying, look, there's going to be no winners here.
You have been pro-Russian in your views in the European Parliament, and you have been supportive of other oppressive regimes as well. Is that because they align with your anti-American views?
That's utter nonsense. When I am pro-Russian or whatever you accuse me of, I'm not anti-American. There are millions of Americans who oppose US imperialism. We work with the Veterans for Peace, the working class men and women of America who've been sent out as cannon fodder to fight America's wars abroad. And the hypocrisy that surrounds this conflict in terms of the US condemning it when it has blood on its hands all over the globe. I'm not pro-Russian. When have I ever? I'm not anti-Russian. I'm not pro-Syrian, I'm not pro-American, I'm not pro-Irish. I'm pro-peace, and I'm absolutely proud of that. And I make
and what you're looking for now, obviously, is diplomacy to resolve this. In order to achieve that, to achieve peace talks, do you think that the Ukrainian people should surrender, that the Ukrainian government should surrender?
Well, effectively, that's what NATO and the US have left them with, because they are very clear that they are not going to come in. They're not going to put boots on the ground. They are not going to put that type of armoury necessary to defeat the Russian.
Do you think that is the solution?
Ground.
Surrender from Ukraine. That is the only way to resolve this?
No, what I think is you call it surrender, but what you're actually advocating is that they continue fighting against an enemy which they cannot win. What you're actually saying is, do I think that the Russian people can stop on their own the Russian military? No, I don't. And the longer that conflict goes on, the more Ukrainians will be killed. So in that sense, yes, I think they should support the idea of a ceasefire.
And should they give up land? Is that what you think they should do?
No, I don't. I think what the international community should be doing is promoting peace. I think there has to be an acceptance from the Ukrainian point of view that some form of neutrality should be factored in.
And that was the Dublin MEP Clare Daly speaking to me earlier.